Here we are at the 6th session of our course on cross-cultural study of leadership. Glad that you made it this far and hope that this has been an interesting time for you as you work through these different materials. Back in 1968, I was living and working on the island of Yap out in the Pacific, and during the last part of my research there, I had the opportunity to be involved in a major political dispute in the village in which I was living. There was the question of where they would build a community house for the whole municipality, and the leader of the municipality was a man who was an important political chief in the village in which I lived. Unfortunately, my village was not the highest village, and so the dispute that broke out was the conflict about whether the house, the community building, should be placed in the village that I lived in or in the next higher ranking village just down the road. As I began to participate in these activities, I had to listen to the gossip. I attended some meetings. I was able to go to court for a court hearing, and it finally culminated with a meeting of all of the major regional and local political leaders at the location where this house was to be built. In every part of this process, I took careful notes. I tried to observe what happened. I studied who was working there. And all of this was so instrumental in my beginning to understand and interpret the nature of Yapi's leadership. Well, out of this, I learned how important political events were for the understanding of leadership. There's nothing like watching and studying leadership in action. A few years later, I had the opportunity to be in a village down in Brazil among a group of Indians called the Deni. I was awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning by this loud shouting right outside of my room. I sat up and I couldn't understand the word that was being said, but by the time daylight came, I immediately went over to my missionary colleague's house and asked him to tell me what was going on. He said, "I don't know. I slept through the whole thing." I said, "Well, you've got to find out. We've got to know what's going on here if we're going to be able to understand these problems." So he went out and asked around, and he came back and told me that there was a big argument that morning about some people coming and asking one of the men for his black glue. And he was sick of it. He didn't want them asking for that black glue anymore. And then another man across the village said he was tired of it too, that people should go out and get their own glue and quit asking him for his stuff. Well, I was pleased to get this information, and then I asked my friend, "Why is it that you ignore these things?" He says, "Well, I just don't want to get involved in their disputes. I don't want to get involved in their gossip." At that point, I told him the story about my experience in Yap, and I said, it's absolutely crucial that you understand these events of conflict. You've got to know about the gossip. If you don't get into what people are talking about, you can't really understand the rules that they have about relationships in society. Tonight, as we look at these issues, we're going to be looking at the political events of social relationships and the rules of the game. To understand the rules of the game, we've got to study people in action. We've got to see how they work. Sometimes people can't tell you what the rules are, but when they're broken, everybody knows and everybody understands, and they can talk about it. So the best way to find out what the rules are to examine the situations in which the rules are broken. If you go through and look at the New Testament, you'll find that Jesus was constantly on the carpet with the Pharisees because he broke the rules. And then Jesus taught them. So it's in this process of the rules being broken that we understand better what the rules are and how we are to react within them. Thank you. This evening we're going to be studying Lecture 11 on page 32 in your syllabus. The focus for tonight is the analysis of events and the understanding of political regime. In this first part of the class session tonight, I would like to just take a couple of minutes and review some of the things that we did last time. If you turn back just a page in your syllabus, actually 2 pages, you'll see that at the bottom of page 30 and the top of page 31, we provided a brief outline for the study of political events. As you reflect on the case study that we're going to do tonight, what I'm going to be doing is taking the concepts that are outlined here: arena, external influences, the competitors' demands, strategic maneuvers, and decision outcomes. And we'll be using those concepts to analyze the case study that we're going to find in 1 Samuel chapter 11. So the methodology that we have is one that we went through last week in terms of the steps. I'd like to begin this evening by showing you how to apply that in a practical way to analyze the case. Then at the end of our study of the case, we'll go back to page 8 in your syllabus and we'll take a look at your assignment in terms of studying case studies and try to give you some idea on how to do this. Let's begin with the narrative in the text, which is in 1 Samuel chapter 11, case study of Saul, one of the first acts that he did when he was king. Chapter 11, verse 1. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh-Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days, so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields, behind his oxen, and he asked, "What is wrong with the people? Why are they weeping?" Then they replied to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came upon him in power, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen and cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they turned out as one man. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. Then they told the messengers who had come, "Say to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be delivered." When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. They said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever seems good to you." The next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We'll pick up the last part of that in a few minutes. As we read through this text, there's a lot of good information there. The writer of the text, Samuel, or someone later than Samuel, took good notes, or at least had a good memory. Now, if your memory isn't very good, you have to be able to understand that you need to record conversation. You need to have some idea of what people said. If we didn't have the content of what people said here, this case study would be very empty. It's the conversation, the questions, the kind of things that come alive and bring to us the dialogue that helps us to have good insight into what went on in this case study. But let's begin with the setting. If we want to understand the concept of arena, remember last week, what did we say arena was?
Actual event happened.
That's where the actual event happened. So in this case, what is the arena? Jabesh-Gilead. What is Jabesh-Gilead? It's a village, a town in Israel. It's got walls, okay? So that when the Ammonites came and surrounded them, they obviously closed their walls so the Ammonites couldn't get in. And they're there besieged, it says. The Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh-Gilead. So the arena is Jabesh-Gilead, a walled town. All right? In looking at the issue of competition, because we say in a political analysis, you look at who are the competitors. Who are the competitors? The Israelites and the Ammonites, exactly. They are the ones that are in competition with one another. And in this situation, obviously, who is the aggressor? The Ammonites. Okay, they are the ones that are perpetuating this against the village of Jabesh-Gilead. In terms of the process of what happens here, there are some rules of the game. And it's quite interesting as you look at this, the rules of the game are fascinating as you watch it played out. Now, nowhere in this case do they talk about the rules of the game, but as I've read it to you, what do you think some of the rules of the game might be? Negotiation, okay? That it's right to negotiate. The people at Jabesh asked for time. What do the Ammonites say? Sure, no problem. Yeah, we'll give you the time. Okay? So the whole idea of having time, being able to ask for help, they said, can you give us time to ask for some help? Okay, so then what do they say? Well, if no one comes to rescue us, we'll surrender. They said, okay, go ahead. see what you can. Now, obviously, they got the gates closed, and the Ammonites can't get in. But there is this kind of dialogue between them that reflects there are certain rules about warfare. There are certain rules about surrendering. There are certain kinds of things expected in hostilities between people at this time. Usually, there are rules in relationship to warfare. There are rules in reference to negotiation, demand, and maneuver. They're all part of the process that you have in a situation of political leadership. So people will often not be able to tell you what the rules of the game are until they're broken. Once they are broken, they will say, that was terrible, they shouldn't have done that. That this is the proper way to do it. Very often, rules are best discovered in the process of their being broken. But sometimes people can articulate for you what the rules of the game are, and they sometimes can tell you why they do certain things on the basis of certain kind of assumed rules. It's not always evident, however. You may have to, as we have to in this text, look at how people act and how they expect other people to behave in terms of the kind of rules that are in process. Okay, as we go on, let's take a look at the event and some of the very specific things that happen in the event. The first thing that the people of Jabesh Gilead say is, make a treaty with us. So obviously, a common customary way of dealing with conflict would be to establish a treaty. That treaties would be part of the process of solving a conflict like this. The Ammonites said, sure, but on my conditions. So in this process, the conditions aren't so pleasant, are they? The first one is, gouge your eye out. Which eye?
Right eye.
The right eye. Why is that done?
Right eye is more used.
Okay, yeah. Oftentimes, if people are right-handed, the right eye is also the eye that they rely on the most in terms of the seeing and so on. If you're left-handed, then it would work the other way. But the right eye is part of the right-handedness, and that was what everybody should be in that society. Right-handedness was thought to be the only kind of handedness. People that were left-handed, they tried very hard to change them to make them right-handed, because being left-handed was somehow having things all out of whack. So the demand was one that they weren't real excited about. So the elders then respond back, give us 7 days. Again, that's kind of interesting. There is this request, and it's conceded, and so they send out messengers. And this is apparently okay. They could have killed the messengers. In other words, the Ammonites surrounded the city and said, no, you're not going to get out. We're going to kill anybody that sneaks out. And they could have watched very carefully to try to make sure no one got away to send for help. But apparently Nahash the Ammonite was quite confident that he could hold the day and said, go ahead, see if anybody will help you. There's other reasons to see why he would have responded this way, as we'll see a little bit later. But in this situation, there obviously were demands on both sides. And it's interesting to see that, each of them trying to play this out to work the situation to their best advantage. Okay, as you go on in the story and you look at the kind of things that happened, we would phrase this in terms of what we call strategic action. Strategic action is how each side plays out their game to try to win. You've all played games. You know that as you work at a game, you try to use strategy to win. If you've played card games, you work at a strategy to try to win. You don't just let it go to random luck. There's always a sense of how can I use the hand that has been dealt to me to come out on top in this process. And this is basically what they were doing here. They were trying to see how they could use the hand that had been dealt to them in such a way that they could come out on top. The messengers were sent, and as you know, we read this, the message got to the people and they wept, and Saul heard about it. Now it's interesting that Saul, filled with the Spirit, responds by cutting up his oxen. What do you think the meaning of this is?
The oxen to them was probably like an important instrument or something that they used for farming.
Okay.
And maybe something of high value in their culture.
Okay. Can you think of a functional equivalent in our culture?
A combine or a tractor.
Okay, right. Now if you think about that for a minute, anybody know what it costs to buy a good four-wheeled John Deere tractor that can haul a 12 plow behind it? At least $100,000. At least $100,000. So the functional equivalent of the oxen here is a $100,000 tractor. Or your Mercedes-Benz. Or whatever it is that you've spent, you know, a substantial amount of money for. What Saul did was he basically cut up a pair of oxen. And if you understand this, the people in Israel did not all have oxen. Only the most prosperous people had oxen. A study in England in 1850s showed that most of the farmers did not have oxen, that oxen were shared around from one farm to another. And they were kind of leased out in the spring so that people could use them because most farmers couldn't afford to keep oxen, couldn't afford to feed them through the winter. It was a very, very expensive task to have them. So here you have a man who has oxen. And what he does is he cuts up his $100,000 John Deere tractor and sends its pieces all over Israel and said, this is what I'm going to do to your tractor if you don't show up to fight. Now, that's a pretty weighty kind of statement, you know, that the farmers out there that are hearing this and are recognizing that there is a very significant thing going on here. This man Saul that we've just made king is going to make trouble if we don't respond. And look at the turnout, you know. What do you think of that turnout? How many thousand? 300,000 and another 30,000. Notice the distinction there. Okay, remember I told you last week what was the conflict? The rivalry. Between whom and whom?
The top frame is the leader.
No, the tribal rivalry.
Ephraim and Judah.
Okay, between, you have the children of Leah and the children of Rachel. Okay, Ephraim and Manasseh are children of Rachel. Judah is the child of Leah. And the biggies are Ephraim and Judah. They are the most powerful in Israel. So it makes a very special point to say here that Saul has the support of Judah. That 30,000 from Judah showed up because Saul is from Joseph's side, remember? He's the descendant of Benjamin. And so Judah, the powerhouse on the other side, if you will, Leah's descendants, showed up with 30,000 people. So that tells you that the people came out in support, that they were there and rallying to Saul's command at this particular point in time. Now, I want to emphasize at this point the symbolic importance of this event. In other words, what has happened is that Saul has done something that not only motivates the people, he does it in such a way that it has tremendous symbolic meaning for them. You remember we looked at Bowman and Deal, we talked about the 4 frames? And here the first action that Saul does, he uses a symbolic frame to get people's attention and to bring them together and to rally them around this particular conflict. He uses the oxen, killing his oxen, sending it out, and telling people, that's what I'm going to do. He also uses a little power on them, which is the political frame, threatening them, saying, if you don't come, this is what will happen to your oxen as well. So whoever does not follow Saul and Samuel, this will happen to them. The terror of the Lord fell on the people, it says, and they turned as one man. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, the men of Judah 30,000. Right, at this point, you have some more interesting political maneuvering. He sends a message back into the city and says that we'll deliver you by noon. And what do the people in the city do? That's right. They tell the enemy that we're going to surrender tomorrow. You know, so they use their own capabilities in the political game. Now, the political game is like that. Especially when the people outside are going to punch out your eye and haul you away as captives, you have to use whatever subterfuge you can to get an advantage on them. So they say, well, we're going to surrender tomorrow. The interesting thing about this is that apparently the Ammonites believe them. And so they kind of relax, and Saul attacks before dawn, and it's a complete rout. There's a complete destruction of the Ammonites' forces. They're scattered, and this is a tremendous victory. Now, as we continue on in the later part of Lecture 12, we're going to see why this was so significant in relationship to Nahash the Ammonite. But it's important to realize that this was Saul's first act as king. His very first act as king. Where do we find him when he gets the message? Doing what?
Farming.
Plowing, farming, yeah. He's a farmer. He's not a king yet. He's still a farmer. After he was proclaimed king of all of Israel, he went back to his father's farm and he went back to work as a farmer. So this was really the first significant act as king. The Lord used this situation to bring Saul forward as truly the one mobilized by the Spirit of God to lead the people of Israel. But at this particular point, he wasn't really ready for leadership. He was still a farmer. Now, if you think about this in terms of your spiritual mentoring of leaders in whatever situation that you're in, most of the men and women that you will work with come out of previous careers that are not leadership careers. Or they may be leadership careers, but they're not spiritual leadership careers. They have nothing to do with serving the Lord in a position of significance for His ministry. And for them, it's a significant transition to move from what they've done before into the position that the Lord has for them. It takes an indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and it may take a very special event like this to help the person begin to have confidence that they can really do what the Lord has called them to do. What kind of confidence did Saul have? Remember from last week?
He did when he was called.
That's right. He hid in the baggage. He was not able to respond to the challenge that lay before him. And it was only in this situation when he heard this terrible message about the people in Jabesh Gilead that he burned with anger and the Holy Spirit came upon him, and then he began to act like a leader. Until that, he was just a regular farmer, doing what farmers did. The outcome of this is a significant transformation in terms of public support. If you look at verses 12, 13, and 14, it says that the people then said to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring these men to us and we will put them to death." Sounds like a good thing to do, right? Remember the grumblers and complainers we talked about last week? How often would we like to put them to death? How often would we like to eliminate them from our systems? And I see this in myself so often. I see it so often in my relationships with people that cause me trouble. You know, fire them. Let them go get a job somewhere else. It's putting them to death, effectively. You know, it's much easier to put troublemakers to death than to live with them. And so the challenge here is that that's what the people say. Where are they? You know, let's get rid of these troublemakers. Let's put them to death. That temptation is one that you've got to constantly work against as Christian leaders, because it is the way the world works. You know, got a troublemaker, somebody that's not doing the job the way you want, you just get rid of them. Find somebody else. There are lots of people out there, and you can get people that can do the job. That's not the way the Lord works. And Saul recognizes that, and I want you to see this. Saul said, "No one shall be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." Saul gives credit where it's due. Saul recognizes that this was not Saul's achievement, that this was not Saul doing a great thing. He says, "The Lord has rescued Israel." All the bad things that you've thought about Saul in the past need to be tempered by this text. Because this text tells you the man that Saul was when he began his ministry. The man that was the same man that was concerned about his father, that wanted to seek advice from the man of God. So Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there reaffirm the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and confirmed Saul as king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. What can we learn from this? Well, I think that there are a number of interesting points. When you satisfy people, they're very happy. It's no surprise. These people in Jabesh Gilead were ecstatic. So were the rest of the people in Israel. But finally, Nahash the Ammonite had been defeated. This is something they had wanted for a long time. So they were ecstatic. They were really celebrating. The other thing that you see here is that there was feasting and reconfirmation. I think that's an important part of the process. As we look at what the Lord is doing here among these people, they then publicly and communally celebrate together the accomplishment that has happened. An application of this, and I think a very important one, is that celebrations are a very important part of good leadership. Celebrating what God has done, bringing people together in a way that brings joy to the whole. There were some benefits in doing this, of course, because in Israel, group was very important. In America, individualism is very important. Sometimes individuals don't want to be bothered with celebrations. But where group is very important, group is a very key factor then in celebrating. The groups enjoy celebrating together. But even where it's a very highly individualistic society, it's important to celebrate what the Lord has done. And if you do that and do it appropriately within the social context, this can advance the mission of the leaders that have been chosen to do the work. Saul certainly was given a much firmer foundation in which to begin his leadership because of this event. Without it, he would not have been a credible king. It was this event that made Saul a credible king in Israel. Now let's take a quick couple of minutes and go back and look at page 8 in your syllabus. On page 8, number 2 focuses on the events, public activity of governing. The case study that we've just looked at deals with the public activity of governing. In this case, it was a battle. It was not settling an internal dispute or acting as a judge. It was really a conflict with outsiders. But it's clearly a case study of public activity of governing. One of your assignments is to do research on some public activity of governing. Whatever it is that you and your team can find that would work. Now, obviously, if you were in the field, you'd want to do more than this. When I was on YAP, every public activity of governing that I encountered, I studied. I took notes on those public activities because they all had some variation in them. They were somewhat different in terms of the way the dynamics worked. And so you've got to tune into this. Because you have got 10 weeks here, I'm just asking you to find one public activity of governing and see what you can do in terms of analyzing that public activity. So that's your assignment. Now, in doing that, you've got to construct a text, a narrative. In other words, if you're going to study an event, you need to have a narrative that you can analyze. You've got to write the story. So that means you've got to answer 5 basic questions. They're very simple questions. Who? What? When? Where? And how? The WH questions. The last one, still WH, okay? All right. Who is involved? That's one of the things you want to get down. You've got to get the names of the key actors. What happened and what was said? Okay, those are 2 key things. If you don't write down what was said, then you won't be able to analyze what was said. If you don't know what happened and record the kind of events that occurred, then you won't be able to analyze the events that occurred. So who was involved? What happened? What was said? When did it occur? You've got to have a time frame. And so you look at over time. And it's interesting, this text that we've just studied is very good on the time. It tells us the key time variables. Give us 7 days. The message got to Saul. Saul came and said, we'll rescue you by noon. And then they went out and said, tomorrow we'll surrender. Tomorrow in the afternoon. So the idea is when time is an important part of the frame, you see, the political frame. Where does it happen? Gives us the arena. The message went to Saul in a particular kind of place. And how did this all go about? We're now looking at strategy, maneuver, the kinds of things that we've been talking about as we have looked at this case. Rules, those are part of the kinds of things that we want to find in a case study. So as you do your case studies, you've got to take notes and get these kinds of things down. After you take these notes, you want to then reconstruct the event. That's your narrative. Put it together so you have a case. In the assigned reading that I've given you some material from my own work on political leadership in YAP. And in that, particularly the section, I can't remember what night you're assigned that section. Let's take a look here. On October the 15th, you have assigned page 217 to 258. You'll find an extended case study there in that section that outlines for you an event and goes through the details of the event, just like I've described to you here. It's basically my creating a narrative just like the one that we've read here in the Old Testament in relationship to Saul. So your goal is to create some kind of a narrative. It doesn't have to be long. It just has to catch the key points. This one really, there's much more that could have been said about this battle with Jabesh-Gilead. We could tell the story of this warrior and that warrior. We could tell about who the messengers were and whether they were afraid or not afraid, and whether they snuck out over the wall or whether they walked right down and the people of the Ammonites just let them go right on through. There are lots of stuff that's not included here. So what the text has given us is what the key things are that helps us to understand what we're supposed to get out of this in terms of the case and why it's presented. The real purpose of this case study is to show how the Lord came upon Saul in the Holy Spirit and how that confirmed him as king over Israel. That was the point of the case. That's why it's included there. There are probably many other battles that Saul fought that aren't documented. But this one is documented because this one establishes Saul as a legitimate leader in Israel. So you include in the case the key things that help you to understand and to comprehend the leadership that's going on in that society. The second paragraph on that page 8 comments, you should observe one or more public activity, see how leaders organize, how they direct the event, how they control or influence information, procedures, decision-making, and action, how followers respond, support, maneuver, or assert their private interest, how public goals are defined and met. These are the kinds of things that you should try to do in a political event. Some of you have said, well, I want to go to the meetings. It's okay, perfectly all right to go to meetings of an organization. But because you're there, it may not be political. It may just be a management meeting. It may just be, hey, we're come here, we've got reports to do, and after the reports we dismiss everybody. And so you sit there and you listen to reports. Now you can find some political behavior going on even in the reporting process, but it's kind of dull. Much more interesting kind of political events are the one like we just read, where you have some major conflict going on. It's much harder in a short assignment like this to get involved in that. Why do I bring this up? Don't despair if you don't get involved in a conflict event, but when you're in the field, you must. In other words, doing field work, that's where you learn the most about the political system, events of conflict. During the time frame that you have in this course, you have to take what you can get. But if you're going to be doing this as part of a field ministry, you must get those conflict events. Do you have any questions about that before I go on? Okay. I have no feel free to interrupt me at any time. This is not a closed session where you can't ask questions. I want you to be able to ask questions. Then we're going to switch to page 33. I'm going to begin tonight lecture 12. It's a rather long one. And I'm going to lecture for the remaining part of the hour and the first part of lecture 12, and then we'll continue it in the next hour. In lecture 12, our primary focus is regime in Israel. In a minute or two, we're going to talk about regime and try to define it. I also talk about moving up grid. And if you remember the concepts of grid and group in our earlier discussion in the course, grid has to do with the definition of status and role, with the elaboration of roles, with the definition of rules, with the elaboration of rules, and the encompassing of individuals in a society within a whole elaborate system of rules and regulations and roles. What we see in Israel is that Israel moves up grid. In other words, grid becomes stronger through the process of anointing a king. And how that happens, the biblical text is quite interesting in showing for us the process by which this occurred and some of the key things that happen in it. Let's first of all begin with a discussion of political community and then look at how political community relates to regime. Why don't we first talk about definitions? We didn't discuss this last week. In thinking about political community, how would you define political community as opposed to another kind of community? In your reading, How did Schwartz, Turner, and Tuden define political community?
Political goals.
Okay, political goals are a part of it. That's good. Speak loudly, okay? I'm getting deaf as I get old.
Goals that affect the public at large.
Okay, goals that affect the public at large. How do you know what the political community is? Is there a definition of community? How is it different from political field and political arena?
Somehow they're bound by a common identity.
Okay. Common identity. Identity is a key factor. Political field, people have many identities. It goes beyond a very broad range of all kinds of people are involved in the political field. Arena, of course, is where the action occurs. So community, if we go back and look at this case study of Saul, would the political community have been Jabesh-Gilead, or would it have been larger?
Israel.
It was Israel, that's right. It was truly Israel. It wasn't just Jabesh-Gilead. Jabesh-Gilead was the arena. But the political community was Israel. The identity was with the people of Israel. And of course, included in Israel was what tribe? Singled out by name?
Judah.
Judah, okay. So Israel and Judah were noted there together. In this historical recording of this, that was an important statement to make. So there is this identity factor, okay? In Schwartz, Turner, and Tuden, they talk about the fact that within political community, things are solved peacefully. As opposed to outside political community, things are often solved with hostility and conflict. So the Ammonites would not have been a part of the political community, would they? Because they come with hostility. They come in anger. They come in looking at us with harshness and wanting to destroy us, punch our eyes out. So they're not our kind of guys. The people in Jabesh-Gilead said, they don't identify with us. They weren't willing to settle peacefully. They didn't want to have a treaty. In other words, if they'd want to have a treaty without gouging their eyes out, they were saying we want to be part of the political community. But by not being willing to have a treaty, by wanting to fight, you then had the conflict. So peace, let's put it that way, peaceful resolution is typical within political community. That doesn't mean that people are always peaceful, but that the general focus of the settling of disputes comes through peaceful resolution as opposed to hostilities and warfare and violence. This, I think, is probably one of the key factors in terms of thinking about political community as the Schwartz, Turner, and Tuden define it. I think it's a useful definition because it helps us then to begin to look at how this community can be distinguished from field, and this allows us then to determine where we can look for rules. In other words, the rules of the game usually occur within a community. There's a common identity, there's peaceful resolution, there have to be rules for resolution. And so what we talked about before in terms of rules and strategies, those come out of the fact that here is community. Within community you have peaceful resolution, so there has to be some kind of process, some way that people can work toward accomplishing their objectives within a peaceful context. Okay, as we think about Israel then, we've already seen that Israel is different from the Ammonites. There are some other passages of Scripture that we're going to look at tonight that will be helpful in this. So if you have Bibles, you might want to open to 1 Samuel chapter 7. And I'll begin reading with verse 13. So the Philistines were subdued and did not invade Israelite territory again. This followed a battle in which Samuel led the people. Then it says, throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. The towns from Ekron to Gath that the Philistines had captured from Israel were restored to her, and Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the power of the Philistines. And there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel continued as judge over Israel all the days of his life. From year to year he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also judged Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord. Now, if you look at this, you see that what are outside of the political community in this text? Philistines and the Amorites. Okay? Those two were groups that had been hostile. They had made peace, primarily because of their military campaigns, and they were successful. So this was a time of peace. Samuel's lifetime was one in which the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. It's interesting then that the territory of Israel during this time was secured. And in being secured, what do you see Samuel doing?
Teaching the nation.
Okay, teaching. When they talk about him going from place to place, what is the word they use?
Judging.
Judging. Okay, what does judging mean?
Rendering justice.
Rendering justice, okay? Settling conflict, settling disputes, peacefully. Okay? So if you see what's happening here, Samuel is going from place to place within Israel. That's why we know Israel is a political community. Because Samuel's role is to be a circuit judge. And he goes from one place to another, resolving disputes between people, helping to settle their differences, and to do it with justice and with according to the rules that they expected in their social context. All right. The interesting thing about this is that Samuel is able to circulate and do the same thing in each of these places. That there is a set of standards about what a judge should do and how they should do it. And Samuel goes from one place to another and carries this out. So we know that it's a political community in the sense that you can go from one place to another and these kinds of practices can be handled. Now, Samuel obviously didn't go to the Philistines and settle disputes. He didn't serve as a judge there, and he didn't do it among the Amorites that was outside of the political community. He did not have the authority there. There was not a set of rules to work with in that context. Okay. Let's go on to B. What are the components of regime? Let's begin by defining regime. You remember from your reading last week. What is the definition of regime? This word is a little bit tricky. What do we ordinarily think of when we think of the concept regime? Dictatorship. That's right. And we think about the Hitler regime, or the Stalin regime, or the Perón regime in Argentina, or something of that nature. The term isn't used that way here, and it's important that we're making this distinction. In fact, not only is regime used in Schwartz, Turner, and Tuden this way, but in the last book that you'll read by Wildowski on Moses as political leader, this concept regime is used there as well. So what I want you to do is to understand how this is used in political science, because it's a political science term, and it has to do with a specific dimension of political behavior that's very important for you to understand. Anybody remember what Schwartz, Turner, and Tuden used, how they described this? If not, I'll tell you then. All right, don't want to play this guessing game. The best way to describe it is rules of the game. Simplest way is rules of the game. Okay? Now, if we contrast regime with government, that might help you. Okay? We can talk about the Reagan government. We can talk about the Bush government. We may be talking in a few months about somebody else's government. You know, we don't know. Perot government, or who's the other guy running? Okay. In thinking about this, governments come and go. The governments have to do with those who are leaders. And of course, when Reagan was elected president, he brought in his own leadership team. And so he appointed all the people who were the department heads, The State Department and the Department of the Interior and the Department of Defense, all those people were part of Reagan's appointees. So Reagan brings in his own government. The regime remains the same. Okay? The governments change. The governments then have to do with the people, whereas regime has to do with how the game is played. Now in America, regime is not just the Constitution. It also has to do with the rules of bureaucracy, the customs that have grown up around the secretaries that report to the president. There are major departments, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the Department of State, the Department of the Interior, Department of Defense. All of those appointments have to do with the bureaucracy that has been constructed over time. They're not in the Constitution. Okay? They're not even part of the law per se. Okay? They're part of a system of regime that has developed historically through time as our government has found particular needs that it needs to address, has formed an organization to meet that particular need, and has then attempted to govern. They have developed a regime which has in it the rules of the game that are part of what we play by as an American government. The governments come and go. Every president brings in his own government, but they all work with the same basic regime.
So whoever in the government, newly elected government, he and his group, cabinet, have to follow those regimes, the rules of the game.
That's right. The regime is there, and they've got to work within it. Otherwise, it's considered illegitimate. The regime is supported in a very complex way in the United States. Every department has its budget. So the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare has a major budget. Well, you don't want to get rid of that department because you don't want to lose the money. So, and there are programs that they are already in process. The previous government set those programs up. You may not agree with what they did, but you can't just eliminate that whole department because there are all those jobs that go with that. And so it's a very complex thing in America. Regime has to do with the whole complex structure of how the game is played, who the players are, what the parts are, how the parts relate to one another, and how we go about managing those particular details.
Does regime change also?
You can change regime, but it changes much more slowly than government. Because if you want to change the regime, that means that you basically have to restructure how things are done. Because regime has to do with structure. It has to do with roles. It has to do with procedures. For example, the U.S. Congress operates on the basis of parliamentary procedure. The Senate has some specific rules by which they work, and some roles within the Senate. Now the Senate is the structure that comes out of our Constitution, but the bylaws, the way the Senate operates, the rules of procedure and so on are not specified in the Constitution. They're specified in the regime, the rules of the game. How the Senate sets itself up to work. And they change their rules, but they have a big battle when they do it. In other words, the rules for committee chairmanship have grown up over time in the Senate and in the House. And the senior members of the Senate and the House are the ones who have first rights to be chair of committees. And so this is part of the game, the rules of the game as it's played by members of the Senate or members of the House in Congress. Bob?
So say the Senate and the House and the President get together and they decide to eliminate income tax and make it a flat tax or a sales tax. What happened? Was that a change in the regime, a change in the structure?
No, that's really a policy. It's the outcome of it's a change in the law that governs the behavior of people. It's a public policy. The rules of the game are how they can go about making that decision, not the decisions that they make. So there are always decision outcomes of any regime, and they can change many policies. The laws, the budget appropriations, all of those things are part of the outcomes of regime as regime makes decisions. The question is, how are decisions made? That's regime. The question of who has authority to implement decision, that is regime. But actual decisions and policies and outcomes, they're the product of regime. Now, in doing your case studies and trying to understand what's going on in the political situation you're looking at, you want to understand that the government that you're looking at right now will fade away. It will go. So when that government is gone, what will remain? What will continue on the same? The present government here at Biola is led by Clyde Cook. And Clyde Cook has appointed a set of vice presidents. I happen to be one of those. At this particular point in time, all of the deans who report to me are deans that I have appointed. And so basically, I have my government. I've put in these people. Now, let's suppose the Lord decides to remove Sherwood Lingenfelter from the scene tomorrow. Okay. And the president then has to find someone else to come in and take my place. In doing that, that will change the government. That new person coming in may want to change who the deans are. Now, that'll take a little time. You can't do that instantly. He could ask for everybody to submit their resignation and start all over again. That happens sometimes. But he can't change the rules of the game. The rules of the game here have to do with how budgets are appropriated. That will take a much, much longer period of time. How, for example, faculty promotions occur. Those are written in the faculty handbook. You have to have a change in the faculty handbook. And that has to be approved by the provost and the university personnel committee. So if that personnel committee says, hey, you're not going to change this on us. We have been working with this for so many years. This is the way we like to work. You can't change it. A new government couldn't change the rules of the game without the consent of the other players. And so the rules of process are process that usually are part of an organization. Now, if you change the whole set of players and they all decide, hey, we're going to do something different, then you really have, you could have radical transformation in regime. Here we're going to be looking at regime in Israel. We're going to see regime changing. I'm not saying that regime doesn't change. It does change. But it changes in a slow process, and it changes in terms of particular kinds of relationships. I think what I'll do in the next few minutes is to just identify some of the components of regime that are part of the case study that we're looking at here in reference to Samuel. It's helpful to look at chapter 7 and 8 again. In chapter 7, verse 16, you see Samuel on the circuit judging Israel in all those places. So one of the things we see about regime is that Samuel had the authority to judge. That's regime. Now, if you go to chapter 8, verse 1, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. So he passed that authority on. He was no longer doing it. But the rules of the game were that you could judge, that there was somebody that could have that authority, and so he passed that on to his sons. All right? The next thing we see is the names. The name of the firstborn was Joel, the name of the second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. So the place they served was different. He was at Ramah. And it says, verse 3, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. It's crucial to understand here that there were rules of the game which the sons were violating. See, Samuel had the authority to judge. He used it according to the rules. He used it honestly, appropriately, making decisions that people saw as being fair and just. So they had a sense of justice. They had a criteria that people should work on. He did not accept bribes. Accepting bribes was wrong. You see, and here's where, in the violation, the rule comes out. They said to him, your son accept bribes and pervert justice. And so this was not appropriate for them in that particular time to do that. The rules were not very elaborate. They were pretty simple. You have a judge, and you have certain kinds of rules that you play by, and those rules have to do with justice in terms of people's disputes and these issues. Apparently, Samuel felt that the rule of succession should be father to son. That's what he did. He appointed his sons. People at first didn't complain about that. They only complained after the sons did the job poorly. And so the people accepted that sons should follow their fathers. That was probably a fairly common practice, that sons follow their fathers in terms of local clan responsibility, in terms of inheriting property in your family. In other words, sons following fathers would have been a rule of the game, if you will, in how it should proceed. In looking then at this case, the rules are fairly simple and rather easy to understand. The last thing that we'll look at here before we break is the tensions and factions and threats that came into this situation and created conflict. There was, first of all, the threat of these dishonest men. By violating the rules and taking bribes, they upset the people. They upset the system. This was something that they didn't want to see happening, and they were angry about it. If you look over in chapter 12, there was also another threat, 12, verse 12. But when you saw that Nahash, the king of Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was king. Apparently, Nahash was at his work before Saul was anointed king. Nahash was a problem to the people in Israel. He was not just besieging Jabesh-Gilead, but he was also creating trouble and creating conflict for other places and other towns. And so the people were anxious about Nahash, and they said, we want a king to rule over us, to defend us. The third situation you find here in terms of conflict is in chapter 13 and verse 19 to 21. It says, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand, only Saul and his son Jonathan. Remember, political problem, resources, scarce resources. Okay? And what this tells us, there was not one blacksmith in all of Israel. And so they were technologically inferior. They didn't have the resources they needed to go to battle with the Philistines. They didn't have the resources they needed to go to battle with the Ammonites. They were in a problem situation. They had real conflict. So because of these three things, the disruption of Samuel's sons in being dishonest, the threat from Nahash the Ammonite, and then the technological problem, they didn't have weapons to fight with outsiders. These people said, we need a change. We want to change our regime. That's basically what they were saying. Well, we'll conclude here, and as we pick up after the break, we'll go on and look at how they changed their regime. All right, we're on lecture 12, page 33. And in our last section, we were able to go through the outline down to the end of point C. So we're going to begin this session by at the D place in the outline, pressures for socio-cultural change regarding regime. Before we do that, however, I know some of you had some questions in the last session, and maybe it's a good time for us to raise those questions and discuss them, and then we'll go on to look at the issue of change. John, you had a question you wanted to raise.
Yeah, in our reading this week, we read about Polynesian and Micronesian leadership. And in Micronesia, the leadership was the big man who had authority through personal power. And what I'm wondering is how that can be an example of regime. It gave an example of how that if a big man died, sometimes a whole section of a tribe would fall apart because there really wasn't any structure there.
Okay, it's important to recognize that regime doesn't necessarily have to have elaborate structure. Again, regime is basically the issue of rules of the game. So in that context, Marshall Solins talks about the poor man, big man, rich man, chief framework. The Polynesians had a highly structured chiefdom kind of hierarchy, whereas the Melanesians had what we commonly call the big man focus for political behavior. Both of those have rules of the game. I think it's, when we look at it, what is the structure? The structure for the big man system is a network structure. focused on an individual and all of the people that he can connect to him by his generosity. So it's what we call a fluid structure. It's one that doesn't have a lot of organizations. It doesn't have a lot of tight groupings or hierarchy. It's basically a dynamic thing built around individuals who elaborate their personal network until they get a very large network reporting to them. The big man dies, the network disintegrates immediately because the network is person connected. And so effectively, you've got a structure, but it's really tied together by personal relationships, not by institutionalization. Whereas the chiefdom in Polynesia is another kind of regime. The rules of the game there are clan. The Polynesians had what we call bilateral clans, where they go through mother or father. But it was basically one in which you were descended, and the person who was the closest lineal descendant from the founding ruler would be the highest ranking person in the group. Again, that's structure, but there the linkage is genealogy, not network. And the genealogical links then provide the framework for defining roles, high-ranking roles being the closest to the pure genealogy, the lower-ranking roles being the more distant relatives until you get very distant. And they develop that into a class system and all other kinds of things that go with it. Both of them have rules of the game. That's the key thing. So the idea of regime is a big man regime versus a chiefdom regime. Both are regimes. So you can have it a personal kind of regime like you have in Melanesia.
So the rules of the game, in the example of the big man, would be the factor of exchange that he has.
Exactly.
So that's the regime.
That's right. The way that you build your network is through exchange. And you know, if for example, Dixon wants to get married, and you're the big man, he comes and says, "I need some pigs, can you help me?" And you say, "Well, sure, I'll give you 5." Okay, at that point, you've got his loyalty. You know, 5 pigs is a big gift. He'll go to his other relatives and other friends, but the big man gave him 5 pigs. He's going to be loyal to you until you die. But when you die, he's got a son by that time who needs to get married. He's going to look around and see what big man can help him marry his son off. And then you're gone, so we've got to find somebody else who will assist in that. What do you expect back? You expect him to go to war with you. You expect him to contribute pigs when you've got a big debt. Where did you get the 5 pigs? You got them from Lisa, you got them from Amy, you got them from Andy, you got them from different people in the group, and different people in your network, I should say, that you have helped in the past. So because you happen to give each of these others 5 pigs when they got married, now you say, "Can you give me 1?" And you, of course, contribute 2 of your own, because if you didn't contribute 2 of your own, you'd be considered selfish. But you can call in ties from others if you've helped them in the past. So that's basically how the system works.
So it is the exchange and the rules that govern that are the regime.
That's right.
Which a new man come in he'll have to do it the same way.
He'll have to do it the same way.
Okay.
He's got the same basic process that he uses to build his career. So there are rules of the game and how you build your career. That's basically how you see it. Okay? Okay, any other questions?
Well, throughout the human history, political revolution can be categorized 2 kinds. One is try just to overthrow the government. The other kind is want to overthrow the regime. And usually that one will last. I remember in Chinese history, the Qing dynasty, all the dynasties before the Republic of China was established, they're all monarchy regime. And then Dr. Sun Yat-sen, our founder, tried to overthrow that whole regime, and then he paid a huge price. But we did have our Republican regime.
Okay, that's an excellent observation, Amy, because you've really hit it on the head. Regime is much harder to change, and it takes a revolution, a significant revolution to change regime. Whereas governments, you can replace one government after, you have one dynasty after another in Chinese history, but the regime remained the same. It was the new democratic regime that represented a dramatic revolution in China. Then the communist regime was another variant of that republic with its revolution. So that when you have regime change, it's a crisis.
Bloodshed.
Yeah. The American Revolution was exactly that. a change in regime in which we were under the monarchy of England. It was set up in a monarchical system, and the revolution was about that. It was to bring about a particular change in regime. So that'll help us to understand Samuel's responses when we get to that. Stephen?
Reflecting on my country's political system, much of the third world countries, where we have the military and the civilian regimes or governments. So I'm just wondering whether or not it could be said that regime changes in such
Okay, if you have military regime and a civilian regime coexisting with one another, that would be then not a change. But if you have the civilian regime and then the government, the military overthrows it and they take over and they run for a while and then they decide to step out and the civilian regime comes back in, that's an alternating regime from one kind to another kind. And usually the military regime doesn't disappear. It just steps into the background and waits and watches to see if the civilian regime is going to do what they want it to do. And if they don't, then they step back in and take over and eliminate all the civilian system and the laws until they're ready to try to release it again.
Yeah, but then the constitution, the country's constitution still remains. And will that not serve as or represent the rules of the game? Because they both have to follow the constitution anyway.
If they both have to follow the Constitution is a little higher level than regime. Okay. The Constitution is kind of like the foundation upon which the society operates, whereas usually political scientists talk about regime as the rules by which the game is played under the Constitution. So, for example, the Constitution of the United States has remained the same since it was first passed, with some few amendments. But regime has changed dramatically through American history in terms of how the government actually works. It was much more simple in the early days. Let me give you an illustration. If you were an American citizen during the time that James Madison was president, all you needed to do to see the president was go up and knock on the door at the White House. And if he wasn't busy, you'd go in and sit down and talk to him. Any American who wanted to go talk to the president could go talk to him. Today, you can't get in to see the president even if you're a big name and powerful person. You know, there's all kinds of people that screen you and keep you away from the president, so that the president sees very few of the American people. They do not have access to him. They cannot talk to him. They can send letters. He never reads the letters. They never get to them. They just count them. You know, what does this letter mean? James Madison describes a situation in which the same man came to see him at least 4 different times to ask him for money. And each time he refused to give him any money. And the man said, well, you're the President of the United States. You're rich. You can help me out. And Madison still didn't give him money. And he complained about it. He says, man, I have to see everybody that comes by. And it takes so much time seeing these people, and they all want me to give them something. It was a very different kind of operation. You know, today, nobody gets in to see the president asking for a loan. You know, but Madison says it was a very common occurrence. People were coming all the time to ask him for loans. So the nature of the game and the way the game of the presidency was played is very different in 1992 than it was in 1805 or 1815. Dramatic kinds of transformation in terms of how the presidency works. Okay, we're looking. Anybody else have a question? We're looking at the regime in Israel, and we're looking at the change. There were pressures to change it. And they were somewhat revolutionary. In fact, in chapter 12, verse 12, we saw that one of the pressures for change was Nahash, the Ammonite. Another pressure for change was their technological inferiority. Another problem for change was that the people who replaced Samuel were doing a bad job. So in doing a bad job, they were not considered effective. So what did the people want? They didn't want to go on with another judge. They wanted a change in regime. It's basically what they said. In then 1 Samuel chapter 8, we have the development of this, verse 5. They said to him, you are old now, your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as the other nations have. So they don't like the present regime. They don't want a change in government. They want a change in regime. Appoint a king. When they said this, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. All right, in thinking about this, I want to reflect in a minute on the pressures that are here and the Lord's instructions to Samuel, and then we'll go on and look at the kind of transformation that will occur in regime, how the rules of the game will change. The first thing we find is that Samuel was angry. Now, I want you to be sympathetic for him. Why would he be angry?
It was disapproval of his leadership.
Okay, it really was a disapproval of his leadership. Not precisely his, but his heirs, his sons. Why else do you think that he was upset? Not just about his leadership.
It was a faith issue, too. They didn't trust God.
Okay.
They didn't trust God's system.
Okay, it really was a faith issue. They didn't trust God in this, and they didn't trust the system that God had given them. Who were they modeling after?
The pagan nations that lived around
Yeah,
them.
the Ammonites that were attacking them, the Philistines, the other nations that were around them, those nations all had kings. So they were looking to the outside. If you look at the Lord's instruction in chapter 8, verse 7, you see he says, listen to them. Respond to what they're demanding. Give them what they're asking for. And then he says, it's not you they have rejected, but they've rejected me as their king. This is kind of a fascinating situation because these people learned about a different regime from their neighbors. And that's very often how new regimes come about. It comes about by having contact with outsiders, of seeing what they do, and then experiencing that and saying, hey, we could do it a different way. We could have a better system than the one that we have. Now, it doesn't always occur that way, but so oftentimes this is a dynamic. You're shaking your head, Amy. What illustration are you thinking of?
Well, I agree, except sometimes may not be just because I see a different regime out from outside. Maybe he compares, and then the current regime is not good. Okay. And then that motivates him.
Okay, that's right. The current regime is not good. You critique it.
Yeah, our founder, Dr. Sunny Sen, went overseas to Honolulu and Canada, United States. He saw this wonderful three-self constituted by Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
So he came back. The whole concept of revolution.
Okay, he had a whole new concept,
Yeah.
you see.
Plus, the current regime was very corrupted.
Okay. And I think those two things go together. The corruption of the current regime plus the opportunity to see something outside that you see working better. And that's basically what the people of Israel did. The current regime was corrupt. Samuel's sons were not doing the job right. And they looked out and they saw that here was this successful king of the Ammonites, Nahash. He was terrorizing everybody. We need a king that can terrorize back. It's basically what they were saying. So Samuel, give us a king. That's what he was saying. Now, I think that in reflecting on this, one of the issues that always comes up as we deal with people overseas in missions is that they see our systems and oftentimes they want to imitate them. Even though they may not be the best system for them, they will often want to imitate the systems that you have in America or in Europe or wherever you come from, because you have obviously more wealth than they do, you have access to power and people and communication that they don't have, and so somehow it looks like if we had that system, then we would have a better life. It's exactly what the Israelites were seeing. They were seeing the other people, saw them having a better life, and they wanted to imitate them. So as you work with people in other cultures, don't be surprised when this happens. You may even be in the situation of Samuel being very frustrated with them and thinking, why is it that they want to do this? Don't they realize that the way they do things will be more effective, and that if we use their systems, they'll be able to use it more effectively? They may not buy it. They may just say that we don't want to do it that way. we like to imitate, or we feel that the other system is better. Not necessarily they want to imitate it, they want something better. They want to look at something that will serve them in a better way. So you may not have a choice of working with the existing regime. They may want to have new rules and a new game. Every time you change the rules, you go into a new game, there is a cost. And this is exactly what Samuel said to the people of Israel. If you look in chapter 8, verse 11, Samuel, verse 10, told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, and now what he does is he does the authority code for the king. We have this section E in your outline there. The authority code for the king establishes what we're going to call a high grid regime. He lists them. Verse 11, this is what the king will do who reigns over you. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. In other words, he's going to have a draft. Okay? And in the draft, your sons are going to be called into the army, and they're going to have to serve in the military. That'll be the first thing. Then he says, verse 12, some he will assign to commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. Basically, this is moving up grid, identifying more positions, more divisions of labor, more responsibilities, the diversification of the kind of things that people have to do. Samuel is explaining here. Conscripted labor and conscripted tax are basically the kinds of issues that they're going to have to do. Then he says, he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. So here you have conscripted household servants, people who have to do the work in his house, who have to take care of his family. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. Land will no longer be land of the people, there will be royal land, and he'll decide what he likes. You remember the story of Naboth and his vineyard, and how Ahab decided he wanted it, and so he took it. Just got rid of Naboth, killed him. So that is what kings do. They have power. They can take what land they want by either just demanding it, taking it by taxes, or getting rid of the people. Verse 15, he will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. In other words, you've got shares. Shares of your crop, shares of your servants. And verse 16, your manservants and maidservants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And when the day comes, you will cry out for relief from the Lord you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. Okay, this is a wonderful passage of Scripture because it lays out very specifically the requirements, the regime, the rules of the game for the kingship. In thinking about this, they wanted a king, okay? This is the king regime that they're looking for. And so what we have seen in this text is what goes with kingship. How does this kingship regime work? What are its components? And what will that mean for you? Now, earlier in the course, we talked about grid and group. And so I want to take just a minute and come back to this for your information and assistance. I'll use this to get us going here. We're going to just talk about grid being that variable, and we'll talk about group being the horizontal variable. Okay, in looking at those issues, where we find the Israelites at the time of Samuel is somewhere in this process. They're high group. In other words, their whole organization is based upon tribe and clan and kinship. And so the tribal organization is very, very important to them, but they are low grid. They do not have elaborated leaders. Basically, it's kinship is the leadership. The elders are the ones who rule. If you read what happens in the book of Ruth, Ruth is a very good case study that is pre-king. You remember Ruth is the ancestress of King David. And so during the time of Ruth and Boaz, there were no kings in Israel. This was the time of the judges. So what you find is elders at the gate of the town in Bethlehem. You find the clan being the key organization. and effectively we can put them in this quadrant of the grid and group framework. It's an organization that is somewhat centralized on elders, but having no hierarchy. When Boaz wants to make a decision about the property, he has to do it in front of the elders in the town. They observe, they agree, and the decision is made. There's no one to arbitrate or to rule. The only high grid feature that you have is the feature of Samuel the judge. And he goes on a tour, judging people as he goes around, and he provides that kind of framework. Now, occasionally during the period of the judges, you'll have a military leader emerging, like Gideon, who brings some high grid into the life of the people, organizing for warfare, engaging them in a battle, and then having certain features of grid in terms of the government. Gideon, Abimelech, Jephthah, these are different men who had high grid qualities. But after they died, the whole system collapsed. And so you have what I sometimes call an oscillating factor here, moving up and down in terms of grid relationships. The judge who is a successful military leader moves the people up grid. Then when he dies, the whole system collapses and they move back down to this clan organization based upon elders. And it really oscillates back and forth in this without any stability. When the people ask for the anointing and permanent king, the effect of this is to move the whole thing up and to make the political community in Israel one that has a king, a military, and a civil organization. Now, underneath all of this, you have the ongoing religious organization of Israel. The religious organization apparently is fairly simple during the times of the judges. If you go back and read the first few chapters in the book of Samuel, you'll find that the key leaders were Eli and his sons. And Samuel was one in the temple, and there wasn't a whole lot of, they got fat from the gifts that people brought to the temple, but there was not an elaborate temple ceremony, the kind of things that we're going to see happening in David's rule. We don't see any of that described in the first chapters of Samuel. You basically find people bringing in offerings and the priests sacrificing the offerings, taking their share and getting fat from it and manipulating the system. But the priesthood existed here. But the priesthood served only in terms of reinforcing the political community of Israel. In other words, people saw themselves as being Israelites because they were part of the common history of Israel. They belonged to Israel because God had brought them out of Egypt. They had this identity that we talked about earlier, and they interacted peacefully with one another through Samuel the judge. So the judge constitutes the feature that moves them up grid, and the priesthood could have done that, but it really didn't serve that effect in the period of the judges. So in looking at what happens with this transformation, you have the beginning of elaboration. Now, how far up on grid? Not very far, because it's not very elaborate yet, but it gets much more elaborate through history. And if you read about Solomon's kingdom, you find a more elaborate system and structure under Solomon. And if you read the prophets and get a discussion, for example, of Hezekiah and of Ahab, you see that Hezekiah and Ahab have much more elaborated grid systems than did David or Saul, or than even did Solomon. It's interesting, you go in and look at the list of officials and their responsibilities and how the prophets criticized them. You see there was much, much more going on in Hezekiah's time in terms of high grid than there was even in David and Solomon's time. Now we'll take a quick look at David and Solomon to see where they were at this particular point. Let's flip the page to page 33. And well, before I go to that, I do want to take just a little time and close out my discussion here on Samuel's legitimacy. If you want to take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 12, Samuel challenges the people in Israel. He says, I have listened to everything you said to me and have set a king over you. Now you have a king as your leader. And as for me, I am old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I have been your leader from my youth until this day. Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? If I've done any of these, I will make it right. You have not cheated or oppressed us, they replied. You have not taken anything from anyone's hand. Samuel said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and also his anointed witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand. He is witness, they said. Now it's interesting, in this particular text, Samuel is first of all defending himself. His sons he can't really defend, but himself he can. He said, I was honest, was I not? And they agree with that. And I respect that. I think Samuel in his old age wanted to make it clear again that he had dealt with them fairly, he had dealt with them honestly. At the same time, they really had gone through a revolution. I mean, a substantive revolution in bringing in a king. They had completely overthrown the regime that was the regime that Samuel had been with. And so Samuel is going to address this. And there is a spiritual issue here, which is a very crucial one. I've heard many sermons on this passage, and I'd like to take a minute to challenge the common sermon that you have preached on this passage. The common message that people get out of this is that Israel should not have had a king. That having a king was wrong, and that this was really against God's will. I would argue that it was in God's plan from the beginning of the world that there should be a king. That Jesus was going to come as the Savior and Redeemer for all mankind, as a king in the line and lineage of David. It was God's plan that there would be a king. It's God's plan that his son Christ would come as not only the king of Israel, but establish his kingdom. The kingdom would have no end. The kingdom of God that we see about in the New Testament. So the whole analogy of the kingdom of God is one that is used throughout the New Testament, and it was God's plan and purpose that Israel should have a king and that Jesus should come in Israel, as the descendant of David. From our theology, we recognize that. So then what's the message here? And why is it that there was a tension here? The tension really was not in the fact that there should be a king. The tension really was a spiritual tension. And I raise this because usually people change regime because they think the regime will do better for them. And that's exactly what God had against them, you see. The real issue was that they weren't trusting God. That they didn't believe that God could save them. They didn't believe that God would defend them. They felt that a king would solve their problems. And so they felt that a change in regime, moving from low grid to high grid, was somehow going to make their political life better. And this is what Samuel addresses. In verses 12 to 25, Samuel says very clearly, when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king. Now, he says, verse I don't want to read it all, but verse 13. Now here is the king you've chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your fathers. Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before you. Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call upon the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. The evil thing here was to doubt that God could save them from Nahash, king of the Ammonites. That was the evil. They said, we want a king to help save us.
So what should be the right way then? We're still asking for a king.
They should have said, Lord, you save us.
Whatever.
And whatever way that you need to do it. Okay. And the Lord would have ultimately given them a king because it was in his plan to do so. And he may have waited another generation and given them David. But they wanted a king now. They wanted it in their own way. And it was the issue that God said, okay, I'll give you a king now. He gave them Saul. And of course, we all know what happened to Saul. He failed in his kingship. And then God anointed David. And David was the one who was a man after God's own heart. We could put it this way. If Israel had not sinned, then it may have been in God's plan that when they were attacked from outside, that he would have said, I have a man for you that will be your ruler, that I will raise up, and he will be the one that I've anointed, David. But it didn't happen that way. It happened this way. They went ahead. There are two lessons in this. One of them is to understand that God is going to accomplish his purpose in spite of our sin. That shouldn't encourage us to sin, but it should encourage us to repent and to trust in the Lord, because he ultimately will do his will. What happens to us when we sin is that we lose the privilege of having God work in us and through us. And then God has to do his work in another way, and he has to accomplish it through other people in a way that still will accomplish his plan and purpose. But God's plan and purpose will be fulfilled. The blessing will be lost for those that rebel against him, and they won't be part of it. But God will always, he says, the scriptures say in the New Testament, God can raise up children from Abraham from stones. So God can accomplish his purpose. He will accomplish it. He'll do it through the people who will be vessels for his work. In this case, the challenge against Israel was not focused on the kingship. And that's where we get the thing wrong. It was focused on the fact that they did not trust the Lord to deliver them from the Ammonites. And that they believed that a king would do it. And what he says here is, you can have a king. But if your king doesn't trust me, it's not going to do you any good at all. Because I still am the one who will deliver you, or I will not deliver you. And the rest of this passage focuses on this. He says, it's the Lord who will deliver you. Verse 24, be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he hath done for you. This is a very powerful verse. It's my father's life verse. The second one is just as important. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will be swept away. And that's really the essence of the message. A king can't save them. A change in regime is not going to make the difference. I think that's an important message to bring to people. There may be an appropriate time to change regime, but not as a substitute for God. Not to try to bring to pass a better way of doing things without the Lord being in it. One of the things that amuses me as I work in higher education and as I work in leadership is that we are constantly revising our curriculum. We're constantly looking at ways that we can do the job better. We're continuing to engage in long-range planning. But the truth of the matter is that all of this is a great waste of time. Unless it's the Lord leading us and directing us and giving us the path to follow. The Lord knows sometimes that we need to do things better. And sometimes changes in regime will help us. But the truth of it is that what really makes a difference in God's kingdom and in God's work is the transformation of hearts and the submission of people to the Lord and their willingness to commit themselves to doing God's work in his way. Now, we are, as you remember, prisoners of our own cultures. We're prisoners of disobedience. We get stuck in a system. And it's really true that the Israelites had a problem. And their problem was low grid. And in having this low grid social system, it was very difficult to bring people together in a coordinated way to deal with the threats from outsiders who were more highly structured. But just organization by itself doesn't produce victory, as the history of Israel shows. It really is God working in them and through them to accomplish his purpose. And when the king followed God, the king was victorious. And when the king lost his way and began to follow sin, then God took away the victory, eliminated their power, and they weren't successful anymore. Israel truly was transformed when they moved into the kingship. You know, they were no longer, if you go back and read the Judges, you'll find that in the Judges period, they were being attacked on every side, and they were always weak, and they weren't able to cooperate together. They were not effective, and it took somebody who was really charismatic, who had a gift of mobilizing people, and who really walked with the Lord, like Gideon, for example. 300 men, and Gideon won great battle against the Midianites. And you look at the kind of things that happened, then there were others that joined and they fought more. But the process of success in these cases was cultivated around leadership that God used for his purpose to bring about the result. Gideon, Abimelech, Deborah, all of them were using a centralized, coordinated process to bring people together to fight against outsiders. And as soon as those people died, the whole system disintegrated. In other words, it fell apart again because there was no leader to take over and to follow. So it's important to understand that different regimes have value. And when we get to Moses, we're going to find that Moses starts here, and then goes here, and then goes here, and ends up here. Because Moses recognizes that in the process of working with the people, that some hierarchy is really necessary to lead a group that big. It's just characteristic of the size of the group and to be able to work with people in that regard. But every one of these social environments is a prison of disobedience. And so a social environment by itself will not produce godly results. And what these people were asking for was a change in social environment. They wanted to go up grid. They wanted to have a king. They wanted to have the structure that they saw being successful for others. They didn't realize that yeah, they needed some upgrade for success, but it really was as God would raise up the leadership, like he did with Samuel, like he did with Gideon, like he did with some of the others that went before him. And the submission to that was the submission to the Lord and the Lord's leadership, as well as to the submission to a leader. John, you have a question?
Yes, I do. You categorize the priesthood as a group. You put it down in group. Okay, that's obviously was a very structured role. So why is that a group role rather than a structured grid kind of role?
It was like Samuel. In other words, the high priest had about the same authority that Samuel had. He really just processed people's sacrifices. He was, as Samuel went around and settled their disputes, Eli stayed at the temple and processed their sacrifices. When Eli died, Samuel went to different places and processed their sacrifices. If you remember the story of Saul's anointing, Samuel had come into the town to offer sacrifices. Sacrifices were not just offered at one place. They were offered in different places around in Israel at that particular point. So Samuel served both as priest and as judge. I neglected to talk about that. Before Samuel, Eli was serving as priest. There was no particular judge, at least a prominent one at that time period, although there had been prominent ones earlier. But the reason the priesthood at that time was I'm characterizing it as low grid, high group, is because effectively they had no more authority than Samuel had. And there wasn't they didn't have the organization that David introduced with all the cycle of the temple and all the singers and all the gatekeepers and all the other stuff that were part of the construction of the temple. Now let's go on to that, because that's where I want to go here in quickly drawing this to conclusion. As you move into David's kingship, you have the whole situation becoming much higher grid. And so on page 34, Roman numeral 2, the changing regime of kinship, you have two basic kinds of orders that emerge in significance. So the one I've termed the military order, the second the priest and ceremonial order. For the sake of our time framework, I'm not going to read all these texts. I cite them here for you for your information, and you can look them up yourself. But the military order grew out of David's support group. He had 30 men who were very, very close to him and who spent time with him when he was fleeing from Saul. And these men were heroic in their military battles. And so that particular support group, and most of them were from his own tribe, from the tribe of Judah, provided a basic core group which became the leadership group for his military organization. Now, in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verses 6 to 8, and in 2 Samuel chapter 8, you have a discussion of the conquest of Jerusalem. And what David did is he promised to whoever was the first into Jerusalem would become the general of his army. And so his sister's son, who would be his cousin, his nephew, sister's son. But remember, David was the youngest. So it's a kind of situation where you got somebody who is his nephew but is the same age. Okay? So his sister's son, Joab, was the one who was first in there, and Joab became the general of the army. Now, that was then a position of hierarchy. Abishai, in one of the 30, was the commander of the 30. Benaiah was the chief of David's bodyguard. You see these men then having formal positions. So once David had become king, those guys who were his close friends now became officials. And you have the transformation from friendship to official. So that means you move up grid. In other words, there's a title, there are particular responsibilities. Now they're not just the guys that fight with me, they have formal titles in terms of the people of Israel. If you look further on in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 22 and following, you have the whole group of tribes in Israel gathering together. And they described in numbers. In fact, let me just take a quick look at that, because you have the statement that these are the numbers of men that armed for battle who came to David at Hebron to turn Saul's kingdom over to him as the Lord had said. This happened 7 years after Saul became king of Judah. David became king of Judah. Okay, he fought with Saul's people for almost 7 years. And at the end of that time, he was victorious. And so it says that at that point, men came armed for battle, came to David at Hebron, and then the scriptures list them. Men of Judah, men of Simeon, men of Levi, men of Benjamin, men of Ephraim, men of the half-tribe of Manasseh, men of Issachar, and so on. Each one is listed in the number who came. And then it tells us in chapter 13, verse 1, David conferred with each of his officers, the commander of 1,000 and commander of hundreds, and then he addressed the whole assembly of Israel. So you have this organization, the tribal divisions, and within the tribal divisions, commanders, based upon numbers. The troops apparently were broken down in terms of components, hundreds and thousands. So again, you've got a military order grid emerging. Now, interestingly enough, I skipped over Saul's first action in 1 Samuel chapter 13, but let me go back and read it to you. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. In some versions, and in the Hebrew it says in the second year, Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah and Benjamin. Okay, at this point he's got troops, 3,000 troops. What did Samuel say would happen with the king? First thing the king would do is draft an army. Okay, so here's what Saul has. He's drafted an army. He's got an army of 3,000. Now, what you see with David is not only does he have an army, he's got 12 divisions, major tribal divisions. He's got commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. Saul only had 3,000 altogether. If you look at what David has here in 1 Chronicles, he's got thousands and thousands of men that have gathered, and they're organized in a hierarchy. They've got a much higher grid organization. And so you see Saul beginning the army and conscripting the troops. David now, as he's consolidating his kingdom, has this huge staff of troops with the general of the whole army, Joab, who he then utilizes in his battles against the Philistines. And you have an ongoing set of battles with them. Now, if you look at Saul's history, you see that Saul developed the army as well. The army got much larger and much more well organized. And we'll take a look at some of that next week in terms of things that happened there. But in just reflecting on the period when David was there, it's much higher grid, much more elaboration in terms of role, a greater division of labor. The administrative staff is very small. The military is much more elaborate. The administrative staff we can find in 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verses 14 to 17. Let me read it to you. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Shavsha was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. And David's sons were chief officials at the king's side. Fairly small organization. Okay. Some of the other texts in 2 Samuel 8, you see Jehoshaphat was the public recorder. Sarai was king's secretary. The bodyguard was the Kerethites and the Relathites, which Benaiah was in charge of, and then David's sons were his aides. So not a big organization. President Bush has a far more elaborate organization than David had in this situation. So if we compare David's kingdom to President Bush's, it's nothing. No grid at all. But if you compare it to what Samuel had, it's much more elaborated. There are many more officials. If you go and look at Hezekiah's officials, or if you look at the officials in Ahab's rule, you'll see that they have a much more elaborated structure with a lot more people involved there in administrative duties and having administrative assignments. It's important for us also to look at the priest and ceremonial order. The priest and ceremonial order becomes much higher grid. It's very, very different from what you have described with Eli when Samuel is taken as a boy to the temple. It's true that Zadok and Abiathar are the priests, but you have the 6 Levitical clans with their responsibilities that were spelled out in the law of Moses, but not put into practice. David puts it all into practice. And in 1 Chronicles 15 and 16, this is discussed in some detail. I'm not going to take time to read through this, but if you take a look at 1 Chronicles 15, you have the heads of the Levitical families called in. They're asked to consecrate themselves. The Levites then appointed particular individuals to be in charge of certain things. The musicians were appointed to sound bronze cymbals. The doorkeepers for the ark were named. The persons to blow the trumpets, the priests, the commanders of units of thousands were to bring up the ark. And then in chapter 16, you have the gatekeepers and all of the other officials that are involved in the sacrificing the burnt offerings, all spelled out. So the text has a whole lot of detail as to what their work was and who was assigned to do it. And again, this is up-grid in terms of the details that are part of their work. Well, all of this is to just help you to begin to see what the change in regime meant for the people in Israel. It was really a significant transformation from a fairly simple, low-grid, high-group social organization to an increasingly complex, higher-grid, high-group organization. Still remains high-group. The tribal identity is important. Solomon tries to break down the tribal structure. In his administration, you see this later on in the book of Chronicles, he divides his kingdom up into 12 territories instead of 12 tribal sections. And he puts a judge over, not a judge, a governor over each territory, so that they're self-appointed governors loyal to the king's office instead of tribal officials who are loyal to the tribe. And of course, that worked okay during Solomon's reign until he died and his son Rehoboam took over and tried to go ahead without listening to the advice and counsel that he got from others. And then there was a rebellion and you had the division. But it's interesting, the north of Israel still became a kingdom in the same model that Solomon had established for the south, for the whole. And those who took over there didn't change the regime. There was a division, but the basic regime was the same. The splitting of the two kingdoms was basically just a change in government. The regime continued to function as it had done before. Now, go back to page 8 again. We'll wrap up this session by taking a look at your assignment on page 8. We've been discussing issues that relate to number 3 on page 8, structure and group. And in looking at that particular assignment, you notice I have in big parentheses there, grid and group. I want you to recognize that structure always relates to some degree of the strength of group and the strength of grid. To what extent are these there? This is a useful tool to help you analyze structure. And what I want you to do in this case study that you're doing in the field is to look at the structured relationships. To what extent do you have strong elaboration of roles and rules and structures of organization, patterns of decision making, or to what extent is it weak and left up to individuals? Remember, we have leaders here. We've got Samuel, we've got the priest, but I'm saying it's low grid because they don't have a whole lot of authority, and every local place kind of does what's right in its own eyes. That's exactly what it says at the end of the book of Judges. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. It was a clan system, not a hierarchical system. After kingship, you didn't do that. You had to do what the king said. If you didn't do what the king said, there was a price to pay. And so you have that kind of structure operating. So you want to look at social groups, public arenas, how the structure works there, whether it's highly elaborated or not. If you were to look at this in America and try to say, okay, what kind of different groups do we have here? Let me just illustrate quickly for you some of the possibilities. I would argue that Biola is high grid, all kind of elaborate roles and structures and situation. I would argue that the Evangelical Free Church in Fullerton is high grid, that it's got all kinds of elaborated role structures operating within it, and hierarchy, and all kinds of job descriptions, and people with jobs who do functions in terms of their job. Biola is obviously more elaborated than the Evangelical Free Church in Fullerton, but the scale is very different. In other words, there you have a small organization at work, maybe 30 members of the staff that work together every day. Here we have 400 to 500 members of the staff that work together every day. So the scale of workers working together means that we've got a much more complex system to work with. They're just larger numbers to work with. Now, if you were to go to Plymouth Brethren Church, anywhere here in Southern California, the largest one is about 300 people. And their organization is just like this. Okay? It's basically elders and the believers who constitute the clan, who committed to that particular denomination, to its basic doctrines, to its pattern of organization. And it is a low grid but high group community. And the groups tend to be small, they tend to be intensive, they tend to have a great deal of commonality with one another. There's a strong sense of fellowship and belonging. It's a very high group kind of organization with no pastoral leadership. The elders are the leaders. They constitute, they're members of the group, they provide that kind of elder leadership. It's an illustration in this complex society of a high group, low grid organization. An individualistic one here, low group and low grid, would be, well, I think Steve in his research project suggested that the vineyard tended to be here, but sometimes moved up here. That there are lots of people who don't know one another, not a whole lot of relationship with one another, small groups that had groupness, but the organization was so big and a lot of individual expression, a lot of individual messages from the Lord, individual direction in terms of life, a strong degree of individualism in the organization with some hierarchy because of the leadership, but probably like Samuel over here. The pastor is a Samuel type of leader instead of a Clyde Cook type of leader who is head of the hierarchy. In other words, who has all kinds of people who are under. The study of leadership in the vineyard suggested that in that organization there were other leaders, but each of them had pretty much the freedom to do their work, and they weren't really tied together into a hierarchy where they had to do something. Now, there may be that's a dynamic changing situation, by the way, as well. But that was their analysis as they looked at it. Okay, that gives you some help in terms of how you might look at groups that you're working with here and try to understand their regime. I've basically sketched out some of the features of organization, but you want to get at the rules of the game and see how they work. To get more help on this, you want to go back and look at Transforming Culture, the chapters that we had on authority in community and the way disputes are settled. I think those can be useful to you. Well, as you read through this and you decide on your projects, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer for them, but I think that'll close this off for this evening. Thank you.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.